There is a place in the Amazon basin where the soil should be dead. By every measure of tropical agriculture, it should be the pale, exhausted, nutrient-stripped laterite that covers most of the rainforest floor soil that looks rich because of what grows above it, but is in fact one of the poorest agricultural substrates on Earth. The nutrients in a tropical rainforest don't live in the ground. They live in the canopy. Cut the trees and the fertility goes with them. What's left is essentially red clay. Farmers have known this for centuries. Clear the land, grow for 2 seasons, abandon it, move on. That's the pattern. That's the limitation. That's what everyone accepts. Except in certain patches of the Amazon, the soil is black. Not brown, not dark red. Black, deep, dense, carbon-saturated black that goes down sometimes 2 meters into the earth. And in this black soil, crops grow with a persistence and vitality that has no agricultural explanation. Portuguese colonists noticed it in the 1500s and didn't understand it. Scientists noticed it in the early 20th century and didn't investigate it. It wasn't until the 1990s that researchers began to ask seriously, what is this? Where did it come from? And why does everything grow in it so well? The answer, when it finally came, was both ancient and almost impossibly simple. The black soil, called Terra preta de Indio, the dark earth of the Indians, was made, deliberately, by pre-Columbian Amazonian civilizations over a period stretching back at least 2,000 years. They made it by burying charcoal, not burning it and leaving the ash, not tilling it in from the surface. Burying specific forms of low-oxygen charcoal, what we now call biochar, into the soil at depth, combined with organic waste, bone and manure, in a managed and repeated process that transformed useless laterite into some of the most fertile agricultural earth ever documented. And then those civilizations were destroyed by European contact, disease and colonization, and the method went with them. The land remained. The knowledge did not. What researchers found when they began analyzing Terra preta was not just high organic matter or elevated nutrients, both of which degrade over time in any normal soil system. What they found was structural permanence. The biochar in Terra preta is carbon that has been stabilized in a form that resists decomposition. In normal soil, organic matter cycles through and disappears within years or decades. In biochar-mended soil, the carbon structure persists for centuries, in some Amazonian samples for over 2,000 years. The fertility is not borrowed, it is built in, it does not run out. This is the point at which the fertilizer industry's interest in the subject becomes, at minimum, worth examining. A soil amendment that works indefinitely, that can be made from agricultural waste at essentially zero cost, that improves fertility across generations without requiring annual inputs. This is not a product. It cannot be repackaged into a subscription. You cannot build a quarterly earnings report around something a farmer makes once from the waste of their own harvest and then benefits from for the rest of their life. The research into Terra preta that emerged in the 1990s and early 2000s generated significant academic excitement. It generated far less commercial interest. And the distance between those two responses tells you most of what you need to know about why this is not taught in agricultural schools, not recommended by extension services, and not printed on any bag of soil amendment at your garden center. Here is what biochar actually is. When organic material, wood, straw, agricultural stalks, nutshells, rice husks, corn cobs, virtually any dry carbon-based waste, is burned in a low-oxygen environment, it does not combust completely. The volatile compounds burn off. What remains is a highly porous carbon structure. Not ash. Ash is the result of complete combustion and dissolves and washes away quickly. Biochar is the result of incomplete combustion under controlled conditions, a process called pyrolysis, and it retains the physical architecture of the original material at a microscopic level. Under a microscope, biochar looks like a sponge, or more precisely, like a complex city of interconnected tunnels and chambers, the cellular structure of the original plant material preserved in carbon. That structure is where the fertility lives. Those chambers fill with water and hold it against drought. They fill with air and create the aerobic conditions that soil microbes require. They become colonized by mycorrhizal fungi and beneficial bacteria that are the real engine of plant nutrition, the invisible biological infrastructure that makes nutrients available to roots. A gram of high-quality biochar has a surface area measurable in hundreds of square meters. The microbial community that can establish itself in that space is proportionally enormous. What biochar does, in the simplest possible terms, is provide permanent infrastructure for the living ecosystem that healthy soil actually is. The implications for degraded land are not incremental. They are transformative. Soil that has been exhausted by years of chemical fertilizer use, which feeds plants directly but progressively destroys the microbial life that makes natural fertility possible, begins to recover. Soil that has been compacted or stripped of organic matter or acidified or drained of biological activity responds to biochar amendment in ways that no synthetic input replicates. Because synthetic inputs work around the soil biology, biochar rebuilds it. These are not the same thing. One creates dependency on the next application. The other creates a system that eventually no longer needs intervention. The practical method is something a single person can do in a garden or on a small farm with materials they already produce as waste. The simplest approach is a technique called flame-cap pyrolysis, a method that requires no equipment beyond a metal barrel or a pit dug into the ground. You layer dry biomass, woody prunings, straw, corn stalks, anything dry and carbon-based, and burn the first layer until it forms a bed of glowing char. Before that char has time to ash over completely, you add more biomass on top. The new material catches and begins its own pyrolysis. You continue feeding the fire in layers, always keeping a cap of flame across the top. The flame cap is what limits oxygen access to the char below, preventing it from combusting fully. You continue until you have the volume you need. Then you quench the fire with water. What remains is biochar. At this point, the char is not yet ready for soil. Pure biochar applied directly to agricultural land actually reduces fertility temporarily. It is so absorbent that it strips nutrients and moisture from the surrounding soil while it charges itself. This is the most common mistake. And it is probably responsible for the majority of failed experiments by gardeners who read about biochar, tried it, watched their plants suffer, and concluded the method doesn't work. The method works. The step they missed is activation. Biochar must be charged before it enters the soil. The chambers and tunnels in its structure need to be pre-filled with the microbial life and nutrients it will hold and provide, not left empty to scavenge them from the soil at the plant's expense. The simplest activation method is to mix freshly made biochar with compost at roughly a 1-to-1 ratio by volume and leave the mixture for at least 2 weeks before application. The biochar absorbs the liquid, the microbial community, the nutrients. It saturates. It becomes what the Amazonian civilizations were creating when they mixed their char with bone and organic waste before burying it. It becomes a living amendment rather than a structural one. Application rates matter. Mori is not better at the early stages. For a depleted garden bed, a 10 to 15% biochar to soil ratio by volume worked into the top 30 centimeters is where the documented improvements in water retention, nutrient availability, and microbial activity begin to appear. At this concentration, the effects are measurable within a single growing season. Tomatoes and peppers respond particularly well because both are heavy feeders that benefit acutely from improved moisture consistency and available phosphorus, both of which biochar-mended soil provides with unusual reliability. The deeper effect is cumulative and permanent in a way that no purchased input is. Each season, the biochar in the soil accumulates more microbial life. The carbon structure does not break down. The chambers do not collapse. The water retention improves season after season as the pore structure becomes increasingly colonized. In documented studies of long-term biochar-mended plots, fertility improvements are still measurable and still increasing after 10 years. After 20. The Amazonian Terra preta has been maintaining exceptional fertility for 2,000 years without a single additional application. A small note on what was happening around the world at the same time the Amazon civilizations were making terra preta. In Japan, a soil amendment practice called sumi, charcoal incorporated into agricultural plots, was in documented use from at least the 8th century. Korean farmers used a similar practice. West African agricultural communities in what is now Ghana produced what researchers call African dark earths, black, carbon-rich soils with the same structural characteristics as Terra preta, found nowhere near the Amazon, independently developed on a different continent by a different civilization working on the same problem. 3 continents, 3 independent discoveries of the same principle. The principle that burning without combusting, burying without decaying, is the mechanism by which dead land becomes permanently alive. What all 3 civilizations knew, and what the agricultural science of the last century has systematically worked around rather than toward, is that fertility is not something you add to soil. It is something you build into it. The distinction sounds philosophical until you do the arithmetic. A bag of synthetic fertilizer bought this season grows this season's crop. A barrel of biochar made this winter from this winter's prunings improves the soil for 20 years, for 50 years, for as long as the land is farmed. One is a transaction, the other is an inheritance. And the reason one of those options fills every shelf at every garden center, while the other requires you to find a research paper from 1995 to even know it exists, is not because one works better. It is because one can be sold. There is something quietly devastating about standing in a garden that was called dead, compacted, exhausted, stripped of anything recognizable as living soil, and seeing a tomato plant grow in it 2 seasons after a single intervention, not because you fed it, not because you watered it with a formula. Because you gave the soil back the architecture it needed to become what soil actually is when left to function, a living system, a biological community, an ecosystem that feeds plants because feeding plants is what it does when it has the structure to do it. The charcoal did not create the fertility. It created the conditions for fertility to create itself. Those conditions last 2,000 years, and you made them in an afternoon from waste wood you were going to burn anyway. The Amazonian civilizations who built the Terra preta did not think of themselves as doing something extraordinary. They were solving a practical problem with available materials and accumulated knowledge. They were not ahead of their time. They were exactly of their time, present, observant, attentive to what the land was telling them, and willing to act on it generation after generation until the solution was permanent. What happened to that knowledge was not its failure. It was ours.